Because this is the everything bubble, this is a bigger, more dangerous bubble than the last one because the numbers are so much bigger. What looks like a small frozen housing market is going to turn into one of the all-time buyer's market. The deals are going to be spectacular, but the losses are also going to be spectacular. So multiple bankruptcies in this sector.
I mean, we're at 40, 50-year lows in housing market sales. I am talking to top producing agents who are having the worst year they've ever had.
And all this finance stuff's not going to matter at all because look at what's happening in geopolitics. We're on the verge of World War III right now. We've got a dementia patient sitting in the president's chair. You cannot trust the mainstream media or the political class or the big corporations out there because they've all got an agenda, or more precisely, they're part of an aristocracy that is trying to bleed the peasants dry, and we're the peasants. You know, the U.S. took centuries to accumulate $11 trillion of debt. Since 2020, we've taken on another $11 trillion. That is a death spiral. The financial system is ready to spin out of control. The experiment that began in 1971, when we went off the gold standard and gave everybody fiat currencies, it's ending. This is financial and economic history. They're going to be writing textbooks about this for the next 2 centuries.
Author John Rubino believes that globally, we're in for some textbook making history. He's certainly controversial in nature. However, John has followed and profited from financial bubbles and wrote books about it. He believes that Americans should be prepared. As he says, we're currently in an everything bubble, and when these bubbles burst, what happens to you will depend on just how prepared you are. I enjoy speaking with John. He's a returning contributor to our channel, and in every interview, he talks about what he believes is going on currently regarding the state of our economy, financial markets, and geopolitical issues that could shape our future, both for the good and bad. Now, I'm not telling you that John's the gospel, but I will say that I try and listen to all sides to what we're being told in the mainstream media and by policymakers and those that have special interests and not our interest, by the way, at heart. Most importantly, for me, I listen very carefully, and trust is something I only give to God. I hope you enjoy the show. John Rubino, welcome back to our show.
Hey, Todd. Thanks for having me back. It's great to talk to you again.
John, you know, the housing market has never been this unaffordable. However, we're starting to see a trend reversal. Home inventory is rising, days on the market is increasing, and price reductions are hitting sellers really at mass scale. And in many markets, and I just covered this on my recent podcast by showing our audience the backside of the MLS, but in a lot of the markets, at least 30% of the houses on the market today have experienced at least one price reduction. Now, this is completely different than just 6 months ago. And many people, you know, they may not know you or know that you have authored and co-authored several books. But one of the books that you wrote was predicting the housing market crash of 2008. And the book called How to Profit from the Coming Real Estate Bust. And along with that, money-making strategies for the end of the housing bubble. And you were referring to the housing bubble back then. But what I find it most interesting, this book was published in November of 2003. And so I want to get in your head a little bit on that. I have read the book, but I want for our viewers and our audience, and I recommend that people, they read your books. But, you know, you had that sort of insight that the housing market crash was coming in a time where we hadn't seen that in our lifetime. I mean, since World War II, home prices have only really gone up. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, there have been dips in the market. I can remember, you know, in the construction business in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, regionally struggling with a recession, and there were a lot of foreclosures and things like that in pockets. But I'm talking about, man, you called this thing right on the money. So, I mean, tell us, I mean, what really gave you the insight to write this book?
Well, by the 2000s, I had already been involved in two financial bubbles. I was a junk bond analyst in the 1980s when that was the big financial bubble that blew up and almost took everything down with it. Then I was a tech stock columnist for an online magazine in the 1990s when the dot-com bubble expanded and then burst in 2000. So by the time the real estate bubble got going in the early 2000s, I was kind of sensitized to the whole mania thing, and it looked very familiar. So the lessons learned from those two previous bubbles made the real estate bubble in the 2000s pretty obvious. And, in a way, too obvious because that book was too early. If it had come out in 2006 or 2007, it would have been bestseller material because it would have been super timely. But, early is better than never, I guess. And so it worked out. But what was happening in the real estate market in 2003, 2004, 2005 were what was all the signs of a bubble classically. In other words, prices were going up to ridiculous levels based on history. Regular people were making lots of money doing things that used to be hard for professionals to do, like house flipping. There were house flippers everywhere back in the 2000s. And that's not a thing you can just do. You really need to understand your market to be able to successfully buy a house, clean it up, and sell it for a profit. But back then, there were, hairstylists and gardeners and people who were buying multiple houses and turning profits on them and everything. So it was obviously a bubble. And it was just a question of how far it would go before it popped. And it went quite a ways. There were the last 2 years of that bubble, it looked like it was definitely time to short everything related to financial assets. And I did that. I was, that movie, The Big Short, where people see what's happening in that market and they get in too early, and it almost destroys them, but they survive. And in the end, they make life-changing money. And I did that on a human scale instead of an institutional scale. But I basically bet the farm on the premise that housing was a bubble that was going to burst and it was going to take down the banks and it was going to take down the home builders. So I bought long dated put options on all of those things, which lost value. And this was the family money, So for 2 years, I was in danger of bankrupting my wife, myself, and my father-in-law with these options expiring. But then it finally worked out, and it turned out to be a big win, which was a formative experience. So now, if I was bubble sensitive before, after that, I was incredibly bubble sensitive, because I want that feeling again of shorting a bubble market and being right. And so that kind of guides a lot of my thoughts now. I spend a lot of time thinking about, all right, what's going to crash, and how can I bet against it and try to make a 10-bagger out of this thing.
Yeah. What do you think of the housing market today?
Well, it's different from the previous market. There's not a frenzy going on like there was in the 2000s. But in a lot of ways, this is a bigger, more dangerous bubble than the last one because the numbers are so much bigger. There's a lot more being bet in the real estate market in general, including commercial real estate. But in the housing market, prices are less affordable than they've ever been. In other words, it's harder for the average person to buy the average house than ever. And that's why there's so few deals being done right now, because there are very few people who can actually buy a house that meets their needs. So most of the house purchases that are happening now are with cash, where somebody sells their Nvidia stock or something like that, or sells a California house and then goes to Idaho or someplace and buys a bigger house for half the money. But there aren't a lot of just regular people with jobs out there buying houses with mortgages. And that's why the housing market itself is kind of small and seems frozen right now. But as you said, inventory is starting to come on the market. And I think there's a deluge of inventory coming our way because we've got three big potential players in the housing market that weren't there last time around. One is retiring baby boomers. If you've got a 3-story, 4,000 square foot McMansion and you're 72 years old with arthritic hips, those stairs just aren't workable for you anymore. You're going to eventually sell that house, or you're going to invite 2 more generations of your family to come live with you. So they're going to be baby boomers downsizing at some point in the not too distant future. And then you got Airbnb entrepreneurs out there, people who didn't just rent out one room in their condo via Airbnb. They went out and bought a bunch of other condos or a bunch of houses. And so they've got a portfolio. They've got this little real estate empire out there. Airbnb is turning out not to be nearly as good a profit-making proposition as it used to be, or I don't know if it ever was, but now it's definitely not. So a lot of these Airbnb guys are they're looking at loans that have to be rolled over or interest costs that are exceeding their cash flow, and they're going to have to start selling too. And then finally, you've got private equity companies. Wall Street became the biggest landlord in the country in the past decade. And they've gone around and just used 0% money because they could borrow so cheaply and bought up entire neighborhoods, converted all the houses to rentals. And that is no longer the kind of sure thing with leverage that it used to be. And what Wall Street does is it piles into bubble assets. See, here's my multi-decade experience in bubbles talking. But Wall Streeters pile into bubble assets. And then when it doesn't work out at the peak and starts to roll over, they pile back out again. They panic sell everything that they bought to avoid going bankrupt. And these guys are going to be big sellers of houses going forward. So I think there's a decent chance that what looks like a frozen market right now, a small frozen housing market, is going to turn into one of the all-time buyer's market at some point, where all these guys are panic selling their houses and their apartments and their condos. And the deals are going to be spectacular, but the losses are also going to be spectacular. So multiple bankruptcies in this sector, a lot of banks taking back properties they don't want and then selling them at a fraction of the original cost, things like that. So I think if you're in the market for a house and you can wait a couple of years, things get very interesting for you going forward, because this bubble, like all the previous bubbles, is going to burst, only with some new twists that'll make the bursting more extreme than any time in the past.
You said started out with something that I thought was very interesting. And when you were comparing the two bubbles, the bubble now, which is way bigger than the 2008 or what led up to the '08 bubble, which was the largest housing bubble and crash that we've had in our lifetime. You said that there's not a frenzy, and what you're referring to is right now. And I think the interesting thing is, and I never really thought about it this way, because I experienced from a builder, contractor, rehabber, and a real estate agent. I went through the GFC, so I remember it well. And but what happened was everything was rolling along. It never really plateaued. It went up and started to crash, and you could see a crash was coming, and it just kept coming. What we have really done so far is we've kind of went up way bigger than the bubble of '08, leading up to '08, but we've now kind of flattened out. We're not seeing the instantaneous foreclosures that we witnessed back then. So I haven't heard anybody say that, and I'm in the business. But that's a very good point. You also, and when you said few deals, I mean, we're at 40, 50-year lows in housing market sales. I'm talking to agents, top producing agents are having the worst year they've ever had, and they've been in the business for 20, 25 years. So what you're saying is spot on. And, and obviously what you addressed here with what could be the cause of high inventory, baby boomers, 30 million of these that are going to be coming into the retirement age, or at least even I look at myself and despite the fact of whether I can afford to live in a big house or not, I don't want to, because I want to do other things with my money. I don't want to continue to waste it on utility bills. That's just my personal thing. But there's no, you don't have people living in your house. You don't have kids. They've grown and moved on, hopefully. The way I look at it, John, there are four main factors that could prop up this housing market and prevent it from a major collapse. And I want to dive into those a little bit. And of course, number one is more government bailouts and interventions. Number two would be if all of a sudden employers across America decided that they were going to pay all of their employees 30 or 40, 50% more, 100% more than what they're making right now, so they can afford to live and buy a house or pay for the home. Or that they would have to limit the supply of available houses for sale, which the government certainly can do with their initiatives. They can restrict the new builds. Or they have to really come up with price stability for homeowners because taxes, insurance, repair costs, and like I said, these regulations, they would have to limit them to reduce the actual price of the home. One of these regulations, and I know you've written a book on that, or co-authored, I believe, has to do with the energy, green energy, but it's very expensive and it adds a lot of cost to the houses. Can you kind of speak on some of those items as to, do you think that there will be more government intervention? What do you think they're going to do to prevent this bubble from being a real big collapse?
Well, I don't think our government is nimble enough to prevent this thing from going south. But I think when it starts to roll over, the government will panic and start bailing out everybody in sight. So it's just a question of how fast it happens. In 2007, 2008, 2009, the crash happened really quickly. So the government couldn't get out in front of it. They had to wait for the crash to start to happen. Equities were tanking, and it looked like, the bankers were in George W. Bush's office saying, we're 2 weeks away from martial law, stuff like that, And so the government then stepped in with some loan guarantees and some bailouts. But that didn't prevent us from having the worst downturn in the worst housing market since the Great Depression. So I think it's probably the same thing again, just because there's so much going on. Remember, this is the everything bubble. We're talking about real estate, but there's 3 or 4 other big bubbles out there, unlike previous bubbles where it was just one sector. Now we've got all kinds of things that you could legitimately call a bubble out there waiting to burst. And I think the government's going to be overwhelmed by stuff like that when it happens, because the banks are on the hook for all kinds of things. And once they start going, that's going to overwhelm all the ability of the government when it happens. But you've got equities that are as expensive and as narrowly dominated as they've ever been. The market breadth, where you've got just a handful of tech companies pulling up the whole U.S. stock market. That's a pre-bubble kind of situation. And in commercial real estate, there's a lot of things going on, especially with office buildings, that make it look like that might be the catalyst for the crash, because it's kind of happening right now as we speak. Government bonds are a bubble where the fact that there even are government bonds right now shows how overconfident a lot of people are in the financial markets, because they're willing to own things like Japanese bonds and long-term U.S. treasuries when those governments are taking on debt at an accelerating rate and seeing their interest costs spike and are, flirting with national bankruptcy at the government level. So there are so many assets that can blow up on us right now that I don't think that the governments of the world are going to be able to step in, single out real estate as the one they're going to save, and then narrowly focus on that and save it, because they're going to have too much else going on. And that is just finance. If you look at what's happening in geopolitics, we're on the verge of World War III right now in several places. It's not just one thing, but we've got I'll just say it, we've got a dementia patient sitting in the president's chair. And the vice president is running a political campaign right now. She's not running the country. So somebody in the White House is making these decisions about us sending carrier groups to the Middle East and F-16s to Ukraine and all these things that are basically putting us in a position to be sucked into something where we are killing and being killed by other nuclear powers. And, you let one of these things spin out of control, and all this finance stuff's not going to matter at all, because once we're in a shooting war with Russia, the price of a house, whether it's a good price or a bad, you won't be thinking about stuff like that. And you won't be thinking about, wow, should I buy NVIDIA right now or should I try to short it? None of that stuff is going to make sense because you're worried about your kids being incinerated in a nuclear holocaust. So the fact that that is kind of a front burner thing right now really complicates the situation that we're in, and should make us, if we weren't already pretty cautious, right, with our finances, we should be extremely cautious now, because there's literally no way to know with any kind of specificity what's going to happen in the next 6 months or year or 2 years.
I hope you're enjoying the interview so far, but I do want to take a moment and let you know that this podcast is brought to you by our very own SachsRealty.com. If you're looking to buy, sell, or rent, and you're in Maryland, we hope that we're your number one choice. But if you're not in Maryland, visit SachsRealty.com and click on the map of the United States, your state, and drop down to a city near you to find one of our trusted referral agents close to you. Now, this is a relatively new program for us, and should you not find someone in your city, send me an email and I'll personally try and match you up with someone that I trust. Now, back to the show. It's been a little while, and I want to cover some of your thoughts on some of the geopolitical issues, and we'll just go right into that. You and I haven't spoken since the assassination attempt on Trump. We haven't spoken since CrowdStrike went down. Was it a fluke? Wasn't it a fluke? But let's kind of talk about, you just mentioned, somebody is making decisions in the White House. Who's in charge? I mean, who is in charge? Who are making these decisions?
Well, even if we can't name them, I mean, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, obviously, they have some say in what's going on. But I think in general, based on America's behavior in the last couple of years, it's safe to say that there's a core group of neoconservatives who are basically people who believe the United States should rule the world for the next 1,000 years, and they're willing to fight multiple wars right now to make that happen. So they're in charge, because otherwise we wouldn't be behaving like we're behaving. We're ramping up proxy wars, and we're arming people who are, well, in the Middle East, there are people there who really want a pan-Middle Eastern war. And the fact that, the U.S. is getting involved right now, and our people seem to want that too, means that it's completely possible that in 3 months, we're literally at war with Iran. And that we don't know where Saudi Arabia is going to come down in all this. And we don't know about all the smaller countries whose side they're going to come in on, what kind of rockets they have, where they're going to, we don't know any of this stuff. And we also don't know about Russia and China being involved in it, because it's completely possible that they might be. So the people in charge in the U.S. seem to want that. They seem to like that as a scenario. And that's what's terrifying about this, because, we're sending very advanced weapons to Ukraine, and then sending soldiers, American soldiers, over there to train the Ukrainians to use them. And now the Ukrainians are using those weapons to strike inside of Russia. Means that it's very easy to envision Russians and Americans shooting at each other in the not too distant future. And where that goes from that point is anybody's guess. But there's an awful lot of nuclear weapons involved, scattered around the world, that could be accidentally set off. Or anyhow, when you start thinking about the possibilities geopolitically out there, it's really easy to spiral into a multi-war, World War III kind of despairing mindset. And so I try hard not to think about the details of this, because there's nothing we can do about it. There's no way to stop these guys, because elections don't seem to matter anymore. Well, that's too strong a statement. It's possible, because we didn't have anything like this going on under Trump first time around. It's possible that him being elected and being able to put some of his people in power geopolitically might pull us back from the brink. And, I don't want to take sides politically here, because I think that our choices aren't the best choices right now. But it's possible that this election does matter. So I'm going to take back what I said about elections not mattering, because it's possible that this one does. But it's also possible that a lot of things happen before the election that we're not even thinking about right now. I mean, you mentioned the CrowdStrike thing. Well, what if we have a gigantic cyber attack and shuts down the internet for the last 2 weeks? And the goal is to skew the voting in a way that helps one party or another. What if that happens? What if we have another assassination attempt and this one is successful? So there's an awful lot that could happen. And one that's actually kind of funny, but is actually sinister at the same time. And all these deep fakes now, where every time a piece of video comes out or an image comes out that might be consequential, the people who are hurt by it say, no, that's a deep fake. That's not a real picture. And it's completely possible that as the election approaches, we're going to see a bunch of those things come out, but without enough time to debunk them before people vote. So it might convince people that it's real and only be debunked after the election. So that, this is a really complex time. And you can find scary scenarios no matter where you look. And, again, I think that just the conclusion that we should come to when we're looking at all of these things that could go wrong at once is be conservative. We can control our finances. That's one of the very few things that we have the ability to set up for certain scenarios. And if we're right about the scenarios and we're right about our setup, that we come through it in pretty good shape. So that's kind of the intellectual challenge. It's, okay, you've got a chaotic world and it's getting more chaotic. Well, how do you deal with that? By arranging your finances, first of all, and then your life in general, second of all. How do you prep for something like the stuff that you and I have been talking about so far? And it's a fascinating intellectual challenge. And it's something where if you get it right, maybe you come through this in good shape, and maybe you come through this in actually better shape than you are right now. So in that sense, it's kind of not an optimistic scenario as much as an optimistic process, because you're working on setting things up so that you're one of the big short guys this time around, where you make life-changing money if you're right about the bets you place, or you're setting things up so that you don't lose any purchasing power no matter what happens in the financial markets, which means you're one of the few people with capital after all this is done, and you have a lot of flexibility in what you invest in going forward and the things you can build and the people you can protect. So all of that is possible in a world that's chaotic. And so what we have to do is figure out what the best mix of decisions, financial and lifestyle, are for each of us, and then put those into place. And that's, on my Substack, that's kind of what the goal is in that newsletter, is actionable ideas, because there's an awful lot of problems and a relative handful of things we can do about it. So we need to find the best mix of solutions and then apply them to our own lives.
You speak about, the election. And I know personally, this is like probably one of the only times in my life that I don't know, what's possible, or what anyone is willing to do anymore. I mean, it's crazy because over the last 4 or 5 years, I'd say mostly over the last 4 years, I talked to so many people that are just so distrusting of our government. And, when we see something that happened, and look, I don't usually get political either on the channel. I think one of the biggest problems that we have is a two-party system. I mean, we have an independent that's running right now to be president, RFK, and he just now gets Secret Service detail. Basically, wasn't even allowed because of the way the system is to debate. Which is crazy. I mean, even if you think about a debate as being, something that would be good regardless of whether he has enough votes or whether he'll win or not, maybe he brings some insight to the table, that we need to talk about in America. But when we look at the way things are, and then I think the biggest shocker for me was in watching what happened with that assassination attempt on Trump. and and kind of what set up to it. And I want to say this because and look, I don't you may not like Donald Trump. Don't vote for him if that's the case. I'm not saying that, but it's still, if you watched any of the hearings, it was kind of crazy. I mean, when you look at the facts that came out and listen to Congress and the interviews that were happening to say, hey, somebody apparently screwed up. And just to think that can happen, whether it was intentional or not intentional, but really to see the comments from people was really the most disturbing thing when they mention things, that are really just awful. But one of the interesting things is, and maybe you can clarify this, John, but I think that I heard a newscaster, and I think I've heard several people of influence refer to Trump as Hitler. Did you hear about any of that?
Oh yeah, that's been one of the political talking points, is that he's literally Hitler. We will literally never have another election if he gets elected this time, and that's part of what has caused people to lose trust in the big institutions in the last decade or so, because just wild stuff like that has been validated by the mainstream media. So I think each of us have had a different journey from relative trust in the powers that be to absolute no trust at all anymore. And for some people it happened because of the rush or the Trump-Russia collusion thing. Some people go further back to the Saddam Hussein weapons of mass destruction thing, where they told us that was true and it wasn't true. But and then you go through the pandemic, where the response to that pandemic, from a lot of people's point of view, was excessive and with an agenda driven. Was trying to make money for a certain group of people. And then you look at all these wars around the world, which seem to be designed to make money for the military industrial complex. So everybody's watching different things. They're all being disillusioned by different things now, but they're all coming to the same conclusion, that you cannot trust the mainstream media or the political class or the big corporations out there, because they've all got an agenda, or more precisely, they're part of an aristocracy that is trying to bleed the peasants dry. And we're the peasants, we're the ones who are being harvested by these guys, each in their own way. Everybody's coming to this conclusion in their own way at their own pace. But there's a term called the shrinking trust horizon, which has to do with how far away you're willing to invest your trust in people and institutions. And in good times, when it seems like the world is run right, you'll trust the United Nations and the World Health Organization and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department to do the right thing and take care of you. And when that trust is broken, you stop trusting those big institutions, those multinational institutions, and you start looking to people like local farmers, who you can drive by and see how their cows are treated, and where their chickens are, or the local government, because you can meet those people face to face, look them in the eye, shake their hand, and get a sense of who they are. And you can understand their policies because they affect you directly. So your trust horizon shrinks all the way back to your town or your city. And I think that's the process that's taking place right now, where, who trusts CNN anymore? Very few people. I think there's a small group of people that still do, but relatively few. And you look at any big institution right now, and you get kind of the same thing, where, we used to think the FBI was the good guys. And now they're kind of the secret police of whatever, or of the people in power right now. Same thing with the CIA. We thought they were out there gathering information to make our lives safer, but that's not the case at all. They're in the U.S. Messing with us. So it goes on and on. Or the big pharmaceutical companies. We thought they were sincerely trying to make safe drugs to cure important diseases. And very few people think that anymore either. And so I don't know how this plays out, but the process of it is pretty clear cut right now. Oh, and then you've got the whole, secession movement out there. It used to be a joke. and now is kind of more and more serious. When people say, okay, we're in Eastern Washington, we want to join Greater Idaho and leave Western Washington. That used to be something you'd say as almost a punchline or something. But now there are people who seriously want to do that and who are gaining clout to actually make it happen. So fascinating times, scary times, and a real intellectual challenge for people trying to do their money right, like you and I are.
Getting back to when I was looking for, was because I was remembering hearing this, didn't think I was dreaming it. I tried to find who said, and I think there were several people who said that Trump was Hitler or like Hitler or whatever. And you cannot find that on Google. You cannot find it. Try and search it. You can't find it. When you try and search anything like that, the only thing that comes up are things that really kind of attack Donald Trump. And I'm not advocating for Donald Trump. I don't want people to think that, because I'm with you. I never really thought that I always believed, I remember when Ross Perot was running for president, I was really kind of excited about that, back in the day, but just personally, because I was a young business person and I was thinking, man, this is what we really need. We need a business person running the country. And then I really realized that they don't want a business person running the country. And that's why I asked you who you thought was in charge, because one would really think, they act like this Biden thing is brand new, and I don't believe that it is. There's certainly been a lot of, chatter about it, but now after the debate, he's got to step down. Everybody was calling for his step down. But I don't know that was any different a year ago. But let's talk a little more about the economy. It is scary times. You say that people will be fine, they'll be okay. There are ways that you can plan financially. And I'm thinking to myself, my gosh, if there's buttons pushed and we get in some kind of I'm close to Washington, D.C., man, I don't know. I may need to come out west where you are, man, and be somewhere that's not in the, in the fallout. I'm hoping, I'm not joking about that. I'm hoping that we don't have a situation like that. But I remember hearing, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and of course, I'm a real estate broker, but I have to pay attention to what's happening on a national level, at least, because that affects my clients, my buyers, my sellers, my investors, my agents, me, on what is the market going to be like? You wouldn't believe it sometimes listening to my show, but I get paid commission. If we don't sell a house, we don't make any money, right? If a house transaction doesn't happen or somebody doesn't rent something. So a lot of times it's counterintuitive for me to come on and say that the housing market is overpriced, or the prices need to come down, or that we need a crash, or that we need some kind of a reset so that people can have a roof over their head. The problem that we have here is we have commercialized this business so much that we have forgotten that people need houses to live in, that they don't have to spend half their paycheck for, and that they can do other things. And the way I see it is we put so many regulations in place that prevent affordable housing from being built. And I'm not talking about government subsidized housing. I'm talking about cutting the red tape, allowing people to build, builders and developers to build affordable housing that the government doesn't have to be involved in and giving subsidy. I'm talking about people that would be proud to, have a house that they can afford, something like my friends and I grew up with in our childhood until we graduated high school, and a lot of my friends, their parents still live in those affordable houses today. So it wasn't called a starter home back then. You were talking about the possibility of war. A lot of people were saying World War III and these kinds of crazy things that you really, we were talking about that back in the day, right? The Cold War and the this and that. But we did see Russia posture or whatever. They ran whatever they did, an exercise or whatever off the coast of not far from Florida with their nuclear submarine just a month ago. But I had heard other podcasters say that they kind of said that, hey, maybe something would happen before this election. We're sure postured in some precarious spots right now. I mean, do you think we could see something like that would actually cancel or delay an election?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the classic strategies that bad governments use to stay in power. They'll contrive some kind of a conflict just as an election is happening. And so it becomes a national crisis. The election happens, but the government says, listen, we can't change horses in this stream, right? We're just going to have to stay in power till we solve this gigantic problem, because if we spend 3 months in a transition, we're existentially threatened. We could lose this war if we aren't on top of this thing every minute of every day. So yes, it's completely possible that that's the kind of false flag that that our government, which has proven itself willing to do all kinds of crazy things, might try. But you could also have the cyber attack we talked about, right? If the power grid is shut down, and remember this, we're heading into winter in November. If the power grid is shut down, that's a semi-existential threat. It's existential for a lot of people who are caught in snowstorms with no electricity. And that could be an excuse. So there are lots, or in another pandemic, right? They're testing out monkeypox and bird flu to see if one of those would be scary enough to allow them to shut down the economy and scare enough people into obeying. And maybe that's the thing that they use, or maybe some combination of those things. There's an awful lot that we now know. After the pandemic and after that CrowdStrike thing, we know it's possible for a big crisis to lead a lot of people to be very willing to obey even crazy orders from the government. So it's possible that's part of the strategy. I'm not saying I think it is. I'm saying it's probably on the list of things that the aristocracy is wargaming right now. They're probably thinking, all right, can we do this? Can we do that? How would this work? And they've got experts from from Homeland Security and the CIA and the FBI all sitting around gaming it out, seeing how it would go. And if maybe they'll try nothing, maybe they'll try one of those things, maybe they'll try two or three, and our elections, leaving everything else aside, our elections are pretty easily stolen right now because we've put a lot of procedures in place that can't be checked. If you're using voting machines that don't leave a paper trail, and that sometimes they're connected to the internet, and that we know now for a fact can be hacked, then if it's a close race, but one guy wins by a small amount, how do you know that's really real? Or if they have, here in Washington State, we have 100% mail-in balloting, where you get a ballot in the mail, you fill it out, you pop it back in the mail. And how do we know really here how many people are just, sitting down with piles of ballots and then signing names of people who they know aren't going to vote to them, and then voting with those hundreds of thousands of ballots? There's really no way to check that. So it's possible that instead of starting World War III and assassinating one of the candidates, they'll just steal this election, and have no way to check it. So lots of things can happen. And I don't know. I don't know if we should trust any of it, because we know the guys in charge are capable already of lying and cheating. And there's no reason to think that they're going to stop being who they are. So, yeah, I'm concerned about a lot of things happening that will change the outcome of the upcoming election in fundamental ways, and that won't be checkable for most people. So it's a big risk. And, let it happen. And I don't know how you ever get back to a trustworthy democracy again, because once you've absolutely seen an election be stolen, and we should note too that the two big political parties already think that the last two elections, at least one of them, were stolen, right? The Democrats thought 2016 was stolen by the Russians in collusion with Trump. The Republicans think that 2020 was stolen by Biden, And now we've got 2024 where everybody's primed to look for cheating if they lose. So that's kind of a recipe for civil unrest at least, and a civil war very possibly. So, ah, Todd, we need to go on to some optimistic stuff here. Let's talk
Yeah,
about
well, I mean,
how much
it's
money we can make if we get this stuff right.
John. Um, we'll try. We'll talk about the U.S. economy. We'll talk about optimism. It's a lot of people. They say things like this are doom and gloom. I think that you have to at least have a clue of what is going on beyond mainstream media. I mean, you have to do some research. You have to do some understanding of the situation. And if nothing less, I mean, look how many people have gone to college, for crying out loud. They're educated. We're dealing with an educated, we should be dealing with an educated population. I never went to college. Well, that's not true. I went for a semester and then decided to swing a hammer and dig holes for a living.
Wise decision.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have any regrets. I'm not advocating not to go to higher education, but you have to self-educate. I mean, but technically, or in theory, when you go to formal education, you are learning how to learn, right? I mean, you should be in a study that you understand or that you're getting to understand. You should be continuing your knowledge, but you should also be able to continue to learn. And I think that if we're closing our minds, I mean, I don't want to listen to just one side. I don't want to just, look, in my business, you say not that many people are listening to CNN, but I'm listening to CNN to see what they're telling the people that are listening to them. So I know what the heck they're telling them. And I want to know what Fox is telling them. And I think both of them have gone off the rails, and, you still can't trust what they're saying, but I have to understand what people are hearing, because I know the majority of people don't look any further than the headline or the blurb that they, and they retain that. And I've always said recessions are kind of like things that were talked in and out of, that there isn't a real tangible thing. They speak it. People hold back their money in fear. They stop spending. Of course, it's a self-fulfilled prophecy. They come back out and say everything is great. People go back to spending money, but that doesn't always work. And we found that doesn't always work when we have people like the Fed at the time, Bernanke, saying the banks are resilient and strong. The housing market is strong. But I want to talk about CrowdStrike for a minute, because I was traveling. The CrowdStrike happened on a Friday, and Sunday, 2 days later, I'm driving to Peter Schiff's house in Connecticut. We have an interview with him on Monday, so we stop off. We have hotel rooms, our small team, at a local hotel, and we get in late at night. It's probably 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And there are people standing at the counter, like, how many people are checking in this thing at 11 o'clock at night? And I was watching what was happening and not really understanding it, but it was like chaos and mayhem. And what happened was they were affected by CrowdStrike, and their systems were down. And they were writing everything down by pen and paper. When somebody comes in, they were taking a picture of your ID, taking a picture of your credit card, because they couldn't finally bill you. They were giving you a room. The attendant was texting herself who is in what room. And here's the big kicker. They couldn't give you a room key because their systems didn't work. So if you were leaving your hotel room, you had to, put the little, latch over the door and not let it lock behind you, which is not really safe, with your belongings inside. And, or if you shut the door, you had to go back down to the counter, get them, and they would go up the elevator with you, real efficient, at 11 o'clock at night. You can imagine they didn't have a big staff. So everybody's waiting to get back in their room and waiting for the guy to take them up to let them back in their room. So I get in my room, and, I had yet to put the latch across the door, and I'm, kind of like getting myself organized, and somebody walks in my room. with the attendant. I'm like, hey, well, what's up? He's like, oh, I'm sorry. So I called down. I'm like, did you forget that you put me in this room? And she's like, oh, it'll never happen again, whatever. But my point is that was just a tiny sampling. People couldn't access their money at ATMs. It messed up air travel. It disrupted a whole lot of people, thousands and thousands of computer systems. Do you think that was intentional? Do you think it was a test, or do you think it was an accident? Because why wouldn't they have redundancy, some kind of a backstepping or a testing before they launch that thing?
Well, you can, in this world, never really impute motives to people anymore because everybody's lying about everything. So you just don't know what's really true. What CrowdStrike said was that that whole thing was caused by a small subset or a subsection of their code being updated, just a little update. And it wouldn't run with everything else, and it shut down the internet or a big chunk of the internet. And remember, there was a thing just before that. Remember when all the car dealerships got shut down because a company that provided information services
They
to
got
car
hacked,
dealerships,
right? I think
yeah,
they were
they
hacked.
got hacked, and so 15,000 car dealerships, all their systems were down too,
Shut
so
down.
they couldn't. Yeah, yeah. So these are probably, well, not probably, but they could be test runs where the aristocracy is trying to figure out exactly how these things play out when they happen, and how would you do it if you were going to do it. And so they're testing, they're seeing how it works. Or it could just be that we're not so competent anymore. In the US, it seems like we can't do things like we can't build jet planes anymore. And there's all kinds of other things that just don't work as well as they used to. Like have you had to go to the doctors lately?
I try and avoid it.
Medical systems don't work anymore. Yeah. So it could be just part of that we're just kind of losing our competence. Maybe because of peak complexity. Things have just gotten so complicated that humans can't run them anymore. So I don't know. But I think in a way we're pretty lucky though that these things are happening. The CrowdStrike thing and the hacking of the car dealership thing, because it gives us a little hint of what it'll be like when a real cyber attack happens or a real virus gets into the big systems and shuts them all down. And it tells us what we need to be doing to prepare. Like, do you have a generator yet? Maybe you should, because what if the CrowdStrike thing happened and went on for a week in February, right? So you could
But you
freeze
better
it.
have some fuel for it.
Yeah. Yep. You need, and then if you get a generator, you need the
Because it
fuel
gets
for
shut
it.
down. You're not getting gas or diesel or propane or anything else for that matter.
Yeah. So that one thing is a long thought process and a long set of steps that you have to take to make it work right. But there's a bunch of those, and with gardening, and with what kind of vehicle we should have, and things
Mm.
like that. You put a wood stove in your house. There are all these things that we could be looking at and thinking through, and trying to make that one thing work as well as possible in the scenario in which the next CrowdStrike is 2 weeks in the winter, something like that. So, and there's 20 different things we need to think through to make sure we get it right. And on the financial side, what happens to your money when the internet goes down? How do you get,
Hmm.
the money the
Yeah.
credit that's in your credit cards, or the money that's in your bank account, or your Bitcoin wallet, or whatever? So what do you do about that? Well, maybe you want physical gold and silver that you've put in a place that nobody else knows about, or maybe one other person knows about, and that you can get to. If things go down, you just bring your silver coins to the farmer's market, and they're more than willing to give you a week's worth of veggies or some honey or some chicken or whatever. So you plan in that sense too, and this is fun in its own way, because it's really interesting to kind of game out for yourself how things are going to go and what you can do about it. And then you get the sense of satisfaction when you complete the list and you're basically set up for this one thing. Your generator is going to run for X number of hours or days or weeks. And the wood stove, and you got plenty of firewood. So that wood stove is basically a permanent source of heat, and your gold and silver coins are where they need to be. It's both fun putting it together and then very satisfying when you get it complete. Same thing with gardening. It's a nightmare for the first 3 years, but after you figure out what to do about voles and things like that, you end up making 1/3 of your food. And that's very satisfying too, and all of these things are possible. All of us can do versions of this stuff. And we just need to, we need to do it right so we don't waste a lot of effort. And we need to do the right things. So the most likely thing is what we deal with first and then on down the list. So very interesting times. And I kind of feel a sense of urgency now because of all the stuff we just talked about. Because it feels like we're getting to the point where one of those big things is imminent. And I'm not saying it is imminent. I'm not saying the next year is some kind of gigantic disaster, but it feels like the water is being tested for something pretty big. And that could be wrong, but it feels like it. And if so, maybe in the coming year, we need to have a lot of our plans done, ready, all lined up.
Well, some of the smartest people we've all heard them say, plan for the worst and hope for the best. I think it makes common sense. One of the interesting things I'm thinking about as you're talking is how unprepared we really are as a society. And I would say the Western world, I'm not talking about globally because there are a lot of people that they have a lot of competencies, but here we've sort of put ourselves into and I was speaking about this last night on my podcast, where Americans have just been indoctrinated into being a consumer. We're just consumers. That's it. We work really, really hard, long hours, and then what do? We buy things we don't need in excess, and we therefore have to continue to work hard. Now, the rest of the world makes out on that because we're buying their garbage. That they're producing, but we're buying more than we actually need, and we don't know how to fix anything. We don't know how to do anything. And if you just go back 100 years, which is not that long ago, and I'm not even saying 100 years, but back in the 30s, even. I'm getting close to 100 years. The percentage of houses that didn't even have running water or electricity in their house, and they lived just fine. They got along fine. If they didn't have power in their house, they were fine. You don't have power in your house now, you're screwed. You don't have anything. In fact, you're not even prepared. They used to call the refrigerator the ice box for a reason, right? I mean, so my grandparents called it the ice box. They remember when they had an actual refrigerator, and they were products of the Great Depression. So, if we really dig in deep and we go, it's not that long ago. For many of us, it was our parents that went through that time, the Great Depression, and times when they didn't have electricity or knob and tube in the house. And for the majority of others, it's your grandparents, or at the worst, your great-grandparents. So, if you're alive today, you're in very short order, your family, your ancestors lived without running water or power, electricity in their home. And, and I think, just talking about this, we need to just, and what we're saying is, okay, I'm not saying that it's going to be, somebody's malicious attempt or attack or whatever it is, or, somebody coming after us, hacking us. Of course, that's probably happening tens of hundreds of thousands of times a day, the attempts. But what I'm just talking about is, what if we have a solar flare that knocks out the power grid? I mean, what if we have something else that has nothing to do with humans? We would really be screwed. So I think the more that we want to say that we're advancing as a civilization, the more vulnerable we become if something doesn't work. And you said what we drive. I know several people that are in some pretty secretive positions. I don't know what they do for a living, but they've done it for a while. And some of them are my clients. And, it's interesting. A handful of these people don't drive new cars. They drive older cars. And you're like, man, you make a lot of money. Why are you driving that old hoopty? You know what I mean? It's kind of like a 1980s or 90s car, or certainly pre-2000. So that's kind of interesting too.
Cars are now basically spying platforms. When you buy a new car, it keeps track of where you are, how you're driving. It records your conversations. It records any kind of texting or anything you do in there. It accesses your phone and uploads the pictures that are on your phone, all to a central location at the car company. And then the car company sells that stuff. And they are allowed to do it. It's legal for them to do that. And hardly anybody knows that, and that's one good reason to buy an older car, pre-electronics, And because otherwise, if you want to oppose a government policy and you want to say go and meet other people face to face who are opposing that government policy, maybe you're anti-war, well, the government now knows, not just because of your phone, but because of your car, where you're going, who you're meeting with, and what you're saying. So I don't think a lot of people get that, but when they find it out, they're appalled. And that's just one more thing that we should know about our world today, and it ties in with the new cars of the world, because they're basically set up. They're like a dream come true for the CIA and for the NSA, because we just permit it. So anyhow, just wanted to say that about new cars.
And a follow-up to that, I mean, think about Tesla. These self-driving or, partially self-driving, whatever you want to call it, whether they're completely autonomous or not, they have cameras that are all around the car. These cameras can, hear their audio, and I think they're always on. And so if you think about that, how does that affect with privacy? I mean, if you pull that into somebody's garage that you would otherwise think that should be a place of privacy. I mean, what if you have a garage or a shop and you bring this car into your building, and you don't want to give them the permission to photograph or video the inside of your garage or anything else for that matter. So that's a big question mark too, with what is happening. I don't think there's any. I think it's fair to say, I was talking with somebody one time, and they said to me, the people of real interest are the ones that have no social media presence, because that's just a normal thing now. So if you don't have it, why don't you? And that somebody that doesn't sort of have like a digital footprint, right? So, they're not carrying, they have a burner phone, or they have a this or a that, or they're completely trying to hide. Like, there has to be like a list of those people, right? That you would say that, hey, they would be really interested in them. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that everybody knows, or the agencies at least know, who went along with things that have happened over the last several years and who haven't, right? I mean, it's, so I think it's fair to say that there are these, we're getting these footprints that are, certainly, it's, and on the flip side of it, John, I'll tell you a story. And my friend I was talking to said, "No way, man, you're crazy." We've been doing a lot of interviewing, because we have several positions that are open for hire, and we're trying to find, for months now, we're trying to find good, competent people. We were expanding our digital department, so we can hit more platforms more frequently. And, people don't show up. They lie on their resumes. They say their resume says they're currently employed, but they haven't worked a job in 6 months. And they say something like, "Oh, I haven't had an opportunity to update my resume." It's like, come on, dude, it takes 5 minutes. I mean, that's full. You're full of it, right? So anyway, I said to a buddy of mine, we were talking, and I said, we ought to have a list for employers with all the employees that didn't show up or lied on their resumes. And he goes, "Oh my gosh, don't even suggest that. I mean, we already have all these lists that are out there. How unfair would that be?" And I said, well, Airbnb does it to their guests. I mean, if you stay in somebody's house, I don't know many long-term rental or any long-term rental sites that say that this person's bad or whatever. But hey, go to a short-term rental place and get a bad review. It shows up. You have a profile, and they identify you as being terrible to the property. And you know what? So I mean, that's kind of like, that's giving people a rating system too. I have no idea where that came from. Completely off topic. Let's talk
You're
about
right.
the economy.
Okay.
You co-authored, I'll say, two books, very interesting books. One was called The Money Bubble, and the other book that you wrote was the collapse, or co-wrote, was the collapse of the dollar. So, John, the question that I have two questions, because they were several years ago. What has changed in your mind since co-authoring these books? And what do you think the future holds for the dollar and our status of world reserve currency?
Well, the one thing I've learned since doing those books is that sometimes things take way longer than you think they're going to, and forecasting timing is incredibly hard because the book, The Money Bubble, came out in 2014. And the things that it predicted are all coming true, but just now. It's 10 years later, and that book is actually timely now because all of the stuff that it predicted are just happening now, like interest rates rising because inflation is spiking, and instability in the financial markets, and this bubble and that bubble all blowing up. That's all taking place now. So that the biggest lesson was that you can't really tell how long something is going to take, even if it's obviously coming. So you need to be careful in your investing in regards to some scenario. You decide something's going to happen, and you're completely convinced that it's coming. But you want to be very careful about investing there's a guy named Rick Rule who's very big in the gold mining analysis space. And he likes to say that you do not want to mix up imminent and inevitable, because those are two very different things. So imminent means it's happening right away. You can bet the farm on it. Inevitable means it's coming, but you don't know when. And you need to know which one your scenario is. And so that was very important to me, because I started betting on the money bubble bursting scenario sooner than I should have. Really, it's basically now that would be a good time to start putting all those bets on. So I put them on a few years ago, and it wasn't a great few years. Not a disaster, but not great either, because being too soon is like being wrong until you're right, and you just hope the right comes soon enough to keep you from going bankrupt. But the things that seemed likely to happen in 2014 were valid, and they're all happening now. The governments of the world are going bankrupt because they're taking on more and more debt, and now the debt has gone parabolic. It's going straight up. The U.S. Took its first 220 years of existence to accumulate $11 trillion of debt. And then since 2020, we've taken on another $11 trillion. So now we're doing in 4 years what it used to take centuries to do in terms of debt accumulation. Japan is the same thing. Their debt is going straight up. Their interest costs are spiraling out of control. Europe has all these unfunded liabilities where they didn't put any money aside for their versions of Social Security and Medicare. And now they're rapidly heading for bankruptcy as baby boomers retire and there's no money to cover them. All this stuff is happening. And it means that the financial system is ready to spin out of control. I'm willing to move it from eventual to inevitable to imminent now. So I think in the next few years, a lot of the things that have been going to happen and didn't are ready to start happening. And some examples of that are, for instance, the U.S. government's debt is spiking now because baby boomers are retiring and governments have just, the U.S. government has just lost its ability to control its spending. So debt is going up. The interest on that debt, now that we had to raise interest rates in response to inflation, the interest on that debt is going straight up. It was a few $100 billion a year not long ago. Now it's above $1 trillion, heading for $1.6 trillion each year. That means we spend more money on interest than we spend on the military and on Social Security, and pretty soon, or on Medicare, and pretty soon we're going to spend as much as we do on Social Security. That is a death spiral for a major country. When you get into that kind of financial territory where everything is just growing exponentially and there's nothing you can do to stop it, your system breaks down at some point in the not too distant future. And we in the US are headed for that. Japan is headed for that. China might be. They're more opaque, but they might actually be worse than us. And Europe, Europe is in a lot of ways, Europe is just a dying culture. And the financial part of it is just one aspect of there's a book called The Strange Death of Europe. Worth reading because it really gets at what's happening over there. So you put all those things together and you get a global financial system that is on the verge of going bust. So the experiment that began in 1971, when we went off the gold standard and gave everybody fiat currencies that they could just make more of out of thin air, it's ending. And it's ending in the not too distant future. And that's what makes this time fascinating from a economics nerd standpoint, because this is financial and economic history. They're going to be writing textbooks about this for the next 2 centuries, and we're living through it. But it's also terrifying because the reason they're going to be writing about it for all those decades and centuries is that extreme things are going to happen right now. And there's no guarantee that we come through this in great shape. But anyhow, long-winded answer for what do you think of the economy? But
no, it makes sense. I want to pull something up here because on usaspending.gov, you spoke about, I mean, we printed more money in 2 years than we did in 200 years. And, you talk about the debt service, that's inflationary in itself. So it's almost like, how can we have deflation? The only way to get rid of the debt historically has been to have inflation, to raise, to inflate the debt away. So it doesn't look like that much. I mean, if you owe, $100,000 in consumer debt, and all of a sudden, you're making $100,000 a year, you're in pretty bad shape. But if now all of a sudden, you can bring in $300,000 a year, you're $100,000 in debt, all of a sudden seems less consequential. So, there are a lot of ways that, of course, that they can do that, raising taxes, which is the most unpopular. They just will find ways to do it anyway. But look at this, is very interesting. And getting back sort of to the housing market and the prop up of just our economy in general, during the pandemic era, I like to say the pandemic boom, because of the amount of money printing that was done, the stimulus, and people argue that, and they say, well, they didn't get a whole lot of money. Some people say they didn't get any money, but mostly everyone was a recipient of one aspect or another. Even if you were a business that was thriving, you thrived even more because of the subsidies and the programs like the PPP, for instance. But anytime we, kind of put everybody in a state of lockdown and then give them lots of money, more than what they need to buy things that they certainly don't need, which we talked about that with American consumer spending, we're really kind of setting it up for a disaster. And then all we have to do is deal with supply chain issues. And of course, the rest takes its course. It's like limiting the amount of housing supply. If we deregulated some aspects, cut some red tape and allow builders to build more housing, and we could flood the market instantly with some emergency affordable housing, prices would stabilize or come down. And, and things would be more affordable. But look at this. This is the total spending by budget category. And if anybody's interested, we'll drop the link below to go on this usaspending.gov. It's very eye-opening, very interesting, shows where the money went. But 44 agencies had a total budgetary resource of $4.65 trillion. And the total outlays are $4.42 trillion. Now, I've seen some, controversy on that number, some showing that even more outlays were resourced. But the point of the matter is that's a lot of money. You and I were just talking about Colorado before we jumped on the recording. And, there was just an article in Denver. I mean, despite millions, 10 million, $12 million in handouts. People are still being evicted. So no matter what has happened, where we gave more money than we ever have in history, Americans are in worse shape overall. And there's a lot of conflicting data with that. But let's talk about where do you think people are going to see financially over the next 24 months? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you following this stuff, and you said you're like an economic nerd on the issue. So, what do you see? I mean, what do you really see happening over the next 24 months? We got an election coming up. We've got a lot of geopolitical issues happening. Financially, we say if they plan, they would be fine. But what do you really see happening?
Well, I see us rolling over into a recession pretty soon here for a couple of reasons. One is that you mentioned that people got some money during the pandemic because a lot of people, the government said, well, you don't have to pay your rent, you don't have to pay your student loans, and here's some stimmy checks. So as a society, we build up something called excess savings, which is more money in the bank than would be expected by just extrapolating prior trends. And it was a couple $1 trillion, basically, that U.S. consumers had to spend as we came out of the pandemic. And we've been spending it. And that's why the economy has still been growing to the extent that it has been, because people had this extra money. Well, we've spent all that. Now we're into negative territory. So we're, instead of excess savings, we're negative savings. And so that can't go on for much longer because consumers are tapped out. Now, at the same time that is happening, credit card debt is going up as people put more and more of their day-to-day life on plastic. So that means you've got more and more people out there carrying loan balances that's charging them, 25% a year or whatever credit cards charge now, which is a recipe for personal bankruptcy, right? You can't manage an ongoing loan if the interest is 25%. So you combine those two things and you get much lower consumer spending going forward. And the economy is 70% consumer spending. So that alone gives you a recession. Then you look over at real estate and you see that commercial real estate and office buildings in particular are rolling over into what could be a pretty big bust because so many office buildings got built in the past 10 years using super cheap money, 2% interest or whatever. And now they need to be refinanced at today's higher interest rates. And during the pandemic, a lot of people found out that working from home is way nicer than going into an office. So offices aren't very, very full anymore anyhow. So the cash flow is low, the refinancing costs are high, and the price at which these office buildings change hands is plunging. Now, a lot of banks have that bad paper on their balance sheets, and they're going to have to report the resulting losses in the office building sector. And that is probably going to spook depositors who pull their money out of local and regional banks, forcing the local and regional banks to sell more of their depreciated assets and report even bigger losses, and so on. So you get a real estate bust causing a bank bust, and forcing the government to step in and bail out what is a pretty big sector. Local and regional banks are several $1 trillion in assets. So that will alone by itself cause a recession too. So you got multiple things that each one is big enough to cause a downturn, but there's several of them happening at once. And that's what I see for next year. Towards the end of this year, it should really be going, because you remember it's an election year. And so the government is actively trying to support the economy to keep the incumbents in power. Take that away and they won't care so much next year. And that's when things really start to fall apart. So I think we get a recession next year. And then I think the potential, because there's so much bad debt out there, the potential for a garden variety recession turning into a capital D depression is very real. And that spooks the world's governments into easing really aggressively. So then we go back to zero interest rates and stuff. And that's when gold and silver go through the roof, because at the end of each bull market for precious metals, there's this parabolic run where they just go straight up. And when governments start aggressively cutting interest rates again, I think that's when it happens for precious metals. So if you want to place a bet on something, a leveraged bet where you use options or something like that, long dated call options on gold and silver, and some of the really high quality miners in that space might be a reasonable speculation, and it might work out in the next couple of years. And there are lots of other investment ideas that flow from the idea of a recession coming sooner rather than later. A lot of them are on the short side, where you're betting against the stock market because a recession usually makes stocks go way down. But there are a few things you can buy, like the gold miners and gold and silver themselves, that ought to go up in that kind of a scenario.
You had said something that I thought was very interesting, and it sort of ties to banking. Number one, I mean, things have been quiet. I mean, we have a massive commercial real estate problem across the country. I mean, it's massive, and we're not talking about it anymore. I mean, there was a little bit of talk about it when we know that 70% of a bank's balance sheet is invested in commercial real estate. These regional banks are really the ones that are holding a lot of these, loans. And you're right. I mean, we're seeing vacancy rates climb. Office buildings are literally being sold for pennies and nickels on the dollar across the country. These buildings are very expensive to repurpose. A lot of these commercial buildings have been standing for 80 or 100 years. I mean, a lot of, obsolescence. Just turning them into even housing is a very expensive proposition. But I want to pull up here. It's the Fred chart, and where you were talking about savings, and a lot of people don't know, but they eliminated during the pandemic era. They completely eliminated bank vault reserve, a bank's requirement to have any reserve to guard against bank runs. And I mean, what's happening right now in a bank run, there was a percentage of money that the bank had to have in its vaults that if people came to get their money, that they would be able to give it back to them. Well, what we're seeing now, which is the scariest thing, is the closing of branches across the country and banks going completely digital and electronic. Good luck trying to walk in and take your money. And for a lot of people, they go in and they want to drain their account. And in fact, they can't do that because they don't have enough money. You have to let them know ahead of time so they can arrange to have the money. But no one's talking about, bank collapse. I've been out to your state. I interviewed WaFd's CEO. And a couple banking experts in Oregon while I was, one banking expert in Oregon while I was out there. And, and of course they said, WaFd said that they were great. And then here it is, a month or two later, and then they announced that they sold some of their loans, like 2,000 of them, or maybe it was 4,000. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look, but it was a lot to Bank of America. And this coming right off the heels the CEO telling me how great they're doing and how they're, in a real good position. Well, why would you get rid of your loans if you're in a real good position? Because you know that if you have to refi those properties and they're looking at double digits, interest rates where they were looking at 3.75 and now maybe they're looking at 9 or 10 to refinance the property, and they have to come to the table, the borrowers, with cash, because the banks are uneasy because their financial statements are no longer strong because of their vacancy rates. So this is like a never-ending, it is an ending because right now what's happening is the banks are just not doing anything. John, I had a situation where a building that I owned, a commercial property, thank goodness I was able to move some things around and pay it off. But what had happened was, I'm opening my mail one day, and I have, commercial loans, and I'm opening my mail one day, and, and it says the whole balance is due, and it's my fault. It was a 10-year loan that I got in 2013. It was a great interest rate. It was 4%. And I had paid it aggressively, and thank goodness, and was always a good pay. And they didn't even give me the opportunity. It was an office building, and they didn't even give me the opportunity to refinance. They didn't say anything. They never called me. The loan had been sold, or the bank had been purchased 2 times since the original bank originator. And they were no longer. Did I have a local rep? They were all regional and out of state, and nobody would give me my rep's phone number. I had to go through LinkedIn actually to get a hold of the rep, and he basically said, "Look, I'll give you a 90-day extension if you like, but we're not interested in refinancing the deal." And and this is from a good borrower, a good pay with a lot of equity in the property. But so people don't realize this, this time bomb that's out there with these properties. But let's pull that chart back up, because you had mentioned something that I want to just show people what you're saying and how factual it is. That spike, this is personal savings. We see this spike right here at the top of May of 2020 was when people were at home, they were locked down, and they were starting to get their checks. So they were putting more money in the bank than building savings accounts to a level that they had never, looking back at this chart, back to the 1950s, they had never had before in their bank account. And look where we are today. I mean, we're back down to, levels of the almost a great financial crisis. I just had people came in yesterday that want to buy a house. They have great credit, but they are professionals. They have 2 jobs, a dual income household. They have a little child, and they don't have but $1,000 in the bank.
Yeah, that's a story that you hear a lot out there of people who, they're living their lives and everything, they're working, but they just never manage to save anything. There's a lot of boomers like that, actually. And, it's a little bit late for a boomer to start saving, but I forget what the stat is exactly, but it's something like 35% of baby boomers have less than $50,000 in the bank, or something like that, and you cannot live on Social Security in this world. So
well, that's kind of how I wanted to end things. Why don't you talk about that? Talk about Social Security and pensions, because there are so many people that are dependent on it. I mean, do you think that is a program? I talked to Peter Schiff, had said that, a couple of them. David Rosenberg, I just interviewed. He thinks that Social Security is an entitlement. Not something that is earned, even though people have paid in 7.65% now of their earnings, I think up to $95,000 a year, and their employer matches that with Social Security and Medicare, known as FICA. That is a big chunk, almost 16% of your paycheck that you're not getting because it's going into FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare. And when I say 16% almost that you're not getting, if your employer didn't have to match your 7.65%, if you're a W-2 employee, that might be money that you could have in your own paycheck. But I guess somewhere along the line, the people that make the decisions for you and me and everyone else had said that we wouldn't be responsible to invest our own money, and we would get to the point where we're older and we wouldn't be able to sustain, and that we would have to rely on maybe the government or people to take care of us. And I personally know people that have nothing more than Social Security and Medicare and now Medicaid, and they're in situations where, they have nothing. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is this something that should be ended, or is it something that they should just say a stop off? Anybody that's paid into Social Security up to this point will continue to get their benefits because we don't want to screw them. But should we reconsider this program that has been tapped into and, really is not adequate?
Well, there has to be a social safety net of some sort. And we set up Medicaid, or well, Social Security first and then Medicaid back in the day, with the idea that we would put aside assets to cover it later on when the boomers retired and their costs went way up. But we took the easy way out, as with everything financial, and we didn't put away nearly enough. What we did put away was government bonds. Think about that for a second. Who pays the interest on government bonds? Taxpayers. So if we put an asset aside for Social Security, basically all that means is that taxes have to go up to pay the interest on the bonds that we put away for Social Security. It doesn't create any extra wealth in any way. So we've reached the point now where those programs are, they're not bankrupt yet, but they're headed that way fast. And it's even worse in Europe, where they didn't put anything away. They didn't even have the pretense of putting it away. It was just pay as you go. And so they're going broke too, trying to finance these basically underfunded pensions. Now, in the lower levels of the public sector, the same thing happened with state and localities, where they set up, a pension plan for teachers or cops or whatever, but they didn't fund it. They didn't fund them well enough to be able to cover the obligations when the time came. So that's kind of a hidden time bomb in our system, where people who think they're going to make, let's say, $3,000 a month from their pension going forward are actually going to get maybe the real equivalent of $1,500. And they don't know that yet. They're walking through life, later life, thinking that they're basically covered, that they got a pension that's going to pay their bills. And that money doesn't exist. So you want to talk about a lack of trust in society? Wait till all the cops and teachers and firemen find out that their pension's only worth half of what they thought it was. That's going to be a revelation, and it's coming soon, because a lot of the assets in state and local pension funds are stocks and bonds and real estate, things that can go down. So they're already underfunded, but they can get much more underfunded to the point of insolvency pretty soon. So you got the federal governments of the world who are able to print more money, and they will cover their version of Social Security and Medicare by running the printing press. That'll be inflationary. And cause civil unrest and mass bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera. We found that out in 2022, what double-digit inflation looks like. And then the state and local pension plans will just go bust. They'll just default and only pay out a fraction of what they were supposed to. And that's all coming. That's moving from inevitable to imminent too. So that's a next 5 years kind of thing for a lot of these plans.
Wasn't the kind of the precursor to that the AIG bailout? I mean, I can remember, wasn't that a lot of the government pensions and things like that? If AIG would have gone bust and they bailed them out, and weren't those executives taking, bonuses and vacations and all kinds of things back then?
Well, the AIG thing is even more interesting than that, because they're an insurance company, AIG, which you normally would think would be pretty stodgy, right? But what they were doing is loading up on things called derivatives, which are basically just private sector instruments. You and a hedge fund cut a deal to pay this if interest rates do this, and that if interest rates do that kind of thing. Well, they had loaded up on so many derivatives that if their derivatives book blew up on them, which it was in process of doing in 2008, it would have taken down Goldman Sachs. I'm not exaggerating here. Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Citigroup. All those banks would have ceased to exist if AIG wasn't bailed out. So that was the first big bailout. The federal government stepped in and said, well, we can't let that happen. So we'll just guarantee all your derivatives contracts. And so the same thing will happen again in some form this time around. It won't be identical, but it'll be some kind of, okay, we're going to run the printing presses and we're going to give you a bunch of guarantees to keep this horrible thing from happening. But because this is the everything bubble, it's likely that, you got the whole world involved in this one, and there's no real way to play whack-a-mole in that way, where you bail this thing out and fix this problem, but you made this other problem worse by bailing this first thing out. And I think that's where we're going to be. And there's no solution for that except for the financial system just to break down and be reset. So that's the big transition that we'll go through at some point, where we just do away with this whole fiat currency, fractional reserve banking thing that worked for a while and has failed miserably now. And we'll replace it with some kind of maybe a gold standard, some kind of a monetary system where governments aren't allowed to create unlimited amounts of paper or electronic currency out of thin air. We'll take that power away from the governments. Again, there are ways to play that. There's an investment thesis in that crazy monetary reset thing that we've got coming, and it's possible to treat that like an opportunity and place the correct bets for it. We'll just have to see which those bets are.
Well, it's always a pleasure, my friend, talking with you. And, I think one of these days, we will be talking about something positive, because I think that, I agree with you. I think we have textbook history getting ready to take place. We haven't seen it in a while. And we've been running a race that is, heading off a cliff. And I hope more people listen to this podcast, follow you on your Substack. We have that below in the description. I subscribe to your Substack. I get your emails, and it's some humor in them too. I like the humor and the satire that you try and lighten things up a little bit, but you have some good, well-founded information. You are. You're a scholar yourself. You don't just you're not making this stuff up. You're scouring yourself, listening to other shows and reading other articles and deep diving. You are a scholar, and I think that at the end of the day, we'll all come out okay if we just prep a little bit, like you said, learn how to do things, become a little bit more self-sufficient. Don't spend so much money. Don't spend everything or more than what you make. And you'll have empowerment. You will feel like you can, make it through downtime. So, and that is very, that's a good feeling. So, thank you, my friend, for joining us again. Any final thoughts or words?
Oh no, I think we covered the whole waterfront today, Todd. Thanks, I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
All right, John. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Take care.
Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end. If you like the video, you can let John and I know that you did by hitting that thumbs up. By doing so, it also helps the algorithms to share the video with more people. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, consider doing so now. Hit that alert bell and you'll know every time we upload content just like this. I love your comments and questions, and actually so does my audience. It encourages engagement that is really necessary so that we can get through these times together. Drop your comments below. And one of the biggest compliments that you can do for me here at Sachs Realty, as I work very hard to bring this information and interviews like this to you, would be to share our channel and this video with your family and friends. It will help us build the best online community together. See you next time.
Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.